I set out early that morning, just before sunrise, with the weight of my pack pressing firmly against my shoulders. The trail I had chosen was known among hikers for its rugged beauty, a narrow ridge that wound through dense forest and eventually opened onto a remote valley far from any road. I had done my research, studied maps, and packed supplies for 2 days, though my plan was to complete the loop in one long, hard push. I liked hiking alone. It gave me a kind of focus that I never found anywhere else. But I also knew that being alone meant every small mistake could escalate into something dangerous. The first few hours went smoothly. The forest was thick, but the morning light pierced the canopy in slivers, creating patterns on the uneven dirt path. I walked at a steady pace, my boots crunching over roots and loose stones. My water bottle rattled against my pack with each step, and I occasionally stopped to sip and scan the trail ahead. Birds were singing, squirrels darted up tree trunks, and the distant sound of a stream promised relief further down the path. I felt alert, yet calm, almost smug in my confidence. As the morning turned to late morning, I reached a section of trail that was narrower than anything I had expected. On one side was a steep drop a few hundred feet down, and on the other side, a rock wall that forced me to navigate carefully around jagged outcrops. My legs burned from the ascent, and my hands were starting to feel raw from gripping roots and rocks for balance. I paused to rest against a large boulder, breathing heavily. The silence of the forest pressed around me, thick and almost suffocating. Even the wind had died down, leaving the rustle of leaves as the only sound. I noticed then that the trail ahead seemed less well-worn. Footprints were faint, almost disappearing. I frowned. Most hikers kept to this route, and the path was usually clear. I debated turning back, but the map showed that this was the main loop, and retracing my steps would cost hours. I pressed on, telling myself to pay close attention. That decision would mark the beginning of a day I would never forget. By midday, I reached a section where the trail curved sharply around a ridge. The drop to my left was nearly vertical, and the forest floor far below looked impossibly far away. I paused to eat a small snack, sitting with my back to the rock wall. My heart was still racing from the exertion, and the thin breeze across my face was a welcome relief. I ate slowly, savoring each bite of the trail mix I had brought, while scanning the area for wildlife. The forest seemed oddly quiet, unnervingly so, as if the usual buzz of insects and bird calls had been muted. It was then that I noticed something strange. I had been careful to watch the trail, but now I saw faint markings in the dirt, drag marks, not footprints. Something had been here recently. My stomach tightened, a warning that I tried to dismiss. I reminded myself it could be a deer or some large animal passing through. Still, the shape of the marks was unsettling. A long, thin groove dragged in a straight line. My gaze followed it, and I realized it led off the trail and into a thick patch of trees. I hesitated, a cold sense of unease crawling up my spine. I told myself again to stay calm. Hikes could be dangerous, but overthinking was worse. I packed away my snack and resumed walking, keeping my eyes glued to the trail. The forest became denser, the light dimming as the sun moved overhead. The path twisted and climbed, and the markers, the signs I was following, became harder to see. I had to step carefully over roots and loose rocks, my boots making soft thuds against the dirt. Every now and then, I heard a distant snap, like a branch breaking underfoot. My pulse quickened, but I told myself it was probably wildlife. Hours passed, and I realized I had misjudged the trail. The terrain was more challenging than the guidebooks suggested. My legs were stiff, my pack heavy, and sweat soaked through my shirt. The sun was beginning to descend, and shadows stretched long across the uneven ground. I began to feel the first pangs of panic. I had estimated that I could finish the loop in 6 hours, but it was already late afternoon, and the forest seemed to grow darker with each step. Then I made a mistake that I would later regret. I decided to leave the main trail. A side path, barely visible, seemed to offer a shortcut across the ridge. I rationalized it. If I could cut through, I would save time and energy. At first, it seemed harmless. The path was narrow, lined with thick undergrowth, and the ground sloped steeply in places. I moved cautiously, but the farther I went, the more the path disappeared beneath fallen leaves and loose stones. After an hour of cautious navigation, I realized I was lost. The trees looked unfamiliar. I could no longer see the ridge or any landmarks. My map offered no help. I could not identify any of the lines or symbols I had studied in the morning. Panic rose, prickling my skin and tightening my chest. I tried to retrace my steps, but the terrain had shifted. A small stream had changed my footing, leaving mud and slippery rocks in my path. I slipped once, catching myself just before tumbling down a slope. My hands were scraped, my pants torn, and the pack dug painfully into my shoulders. I stopped to assess my situation. I was alone, far from the trail with night approaching. My phone had no signal and the GPS battery was nearly dead. I tried to remain calm. I unpacked my flashlight, checked my water supply, and rationed what food I had left. I knew that I needed to find higher ground to get my bearings. Slowly, painfully, I climbed a steep incline using trees for support. The ground was treacherous, loose rocks shifting under my weight, and every step was an exercise in balance and caution. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest grew almost black. My flashlight provided only a small circle of light, revealing glimpses of mossy rocks and twisted roots. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees, and the temperature dropped sharply. I wrapped my jacket tighter and pressed on, aware that a fall in this darkness could be fatal. Every sound was amplified: the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an animal, the snap of a branch. I had no idea what was watching me. If anything, hours passed in a blur of careful steps, pain, and exhaustion. My knees ached, my hands were raw, and the pack felt like a mountain on my back. I found a narrow ledge along a cliff, and I sat for a moment, trying to calm my racing heart. I considered staying there for the night, but the ledge was too narrow, too exposed. I needed a safer spot. Moving slowly, I discovered a small depression in the ground, surrounded by fallen trees. It was not ideal, but it was sheltered. I sat down, unpacked a bit of food, and drank water. My hands shook, and I realized how close I had come to truly panicking. Sleep was impossible. Every sound in the forest made me jump, and my body ached in ways I had never experienced. I stayed alert, scanning with my flashlight, listening, feeling every vibration in the earth. At some point, I realized I was not just physically exhausted, but mentally drained. I had no plan, no clear route, and the forest seemed endless in every direction. I stayed there, shivering under my jacket, until the first gray light of dawn touched the sky. When I moved again, I tried to climb to the highest point I could find. The early morning provided slightly better visibility, and I could see a ridge in the distance. I made my way toward it, slowly and carefully, noting landmarks and using the rising sun to orient myself. Every step was cautious. The ground was still uneven, and loose stones threatened to fall at any moment. The forest seemed to sense my desperation, silent and vast, an indifferent world that cared nothing for my struggle. After several hours, I reached the ridge. From there, I could see a valley below and a line of trees that looked familiar. I remembered that a small trail ran along that line. My heart lifted. I had found a point of reference. I descended cautiously, using the ridge to guide me, until I could pick up the faint trail markers I had passed the previous day. Relief surged through me, mingled with exhaustion and lingering fear. I followed the trail back toward the main loop, each step deliberate, each breath shallow and controlled. By mid-afternoon, I emerged from the dense forest onto the main trail. I recognized the landmarks, the bends in the path, the trees I had passed the day before. My relief was immense, almost overwhelming. I walked the remaining miles slowly, careful not to slip, until I finally saw the parking area where my car was waiting. The sense of safety was almost physical. The tension that had gripped my body for hours began to ease. I collapsed against my car for a moment, unable to stand, simply breathing in the relief of having survived. The experience left me changed. I had underestimated the trail, the forest, and my own vulnerability. The fear I had felt was raw and real, not imagined or fantastical. I realized that nature does not care, does not notice, and does not forgive. But I also felt a sense of accomplishment, a recognition that I had survived through caution, perseverance, and focus. I had made mistakes, but I had endured. I drove home slowly, replaying every moment in my mind, every slip, every misstep, every small victory. I knew I would hike again, but never without more preparation, never without respect for the forest and its dangers. That day, alone and lost, had been the scariest and most intense experience of my life, and the lessons I carried were as clear as the sunlight that eventually broke through the trees. I had faced fear, exhaustion, and uncertainty, and I had emerged whole, wiser, and profoundly aware of the fragile balance between courage and recklessness. I had planned this hike for months. I wanted to challenge myself and escape the noise of the city for a while. The trail I picked was known for its remoteness and difficulty, winding through a dense forest that stretched for miles, rising sharply into rugged mountains. I had read some trip reports online, and while some described the beauty and isolation, others warned about the steep paths, unstable terrain, and sudden weather changes. I thought I was prepared. I had good boots, a full pack, a map, compass, GPS, and enough food and water for 3 days. I left early in the morning, the sun barely peeking over the horizon, painting the sky in faint shades of orange and pink. The first few hours were easy. The path was wide enough, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and insects. I felt a calm sense of peace walking under the canopy of towering pines and oaks. Sunlight filtered through the branches, creating patterns on the dirt trail. I kept a steady pace, stopping occasionally to take a sip of water or snap a photo of a moss-covered rock or a stream trickling over stones. The air smelled clean and fresh, earthy with the scent of damp leaves and pine needles. After about 4 hours, the trail started to get steeper. The forest thickened, and the path narrowed, twisting around massive roots and over fallen logs. My legs began to tire, and my breathing became heavier. I reminded myself to pace carefully, planting each foot firmly to avoid slipping. There were occasional markers on trees, but they were far apart, and I had to pay close attention to the map to make sure I stayed on track. I crossed a few small creeks, carefully balancing on wet rocks. The sound of rushing water was soothing, but it also made me more aware of how isolated I was. By midday, I had reached a ridge. The view opened up, revealing steep cliffs dropping into valleys far below. I paused to rest, drinking water and eating a small snack. The wind was stronger here, colder, and it ruffled the branches. I could see clouds gathering in the distance, rolling over the mountains like smoke. I made a mental note to check the weather more often. Then I pushed onward, following the trail as it climbed sharply. The forest became denser, almost oppressive. The sunlight barely penetrated the thick canopy, leaving the ground in semi-darkness. I noticed that the trail was getting muddy in places, slick with rain from a storm earlier in the week. I had to step carefully to avoid slipping on wet roots and rocks. My pack felt heavier with each step. Around mid-afternoon, I noticed something strange, a sudden silence. The birds had stopped chirping, the wind was barely audible, and the forest felt unnaturally still. I paused, scanning the trees and listening, but there was no sound except my own breathing and the crunch of leaves under my boots. I shook my head, telling myself I was imagining things. Then, as I continued, I realized the trail had split, and the marker indicating the correct path was missing. I checked the map, trying to figure out which way to go, but the two options looked almost identical. I considered retracing my steps, but I knew I had already covered several miles, and going back now would cost too much daylight. I chose a path that seemed more worn, hoping it was the right one. The further I went, the more treacherous the trail became. Large rocks jutted out from the ground, tree roots formed natural traps, and the incline was steep. I had to use my hands in some places to pull myself up. My legs burned, my palms were scraped and raw, and sweat ran down my face. I checked the time and realized it was already late afternoon. I needed to find a safe place to set up camp soon, or I would be hiking in the dark. As the trail twisted around a ridge, I saw a faint clearing ahead. It looked like a possible spot to rest, so I headed toward it. But as I approached, I realized the clearing was not empty. A large rockslide had partially covered the path, and the ground was unstable. Rocks were loose, some the size of my fists, others larger, piled precariously. I carefully stepped through, testing each rock before putting my full weight on it. My heart pounded, every step tense. A small rock shifted under my boot, sending a cascade of stones down the slope. I froze, listening to the echo of rocks tumbling, hoping I hadn't disturbed anything further below. Once past the rockslide, I found a small patch of flat ground among the trees. It was barely big enough for my sleeping pad, but it would have to do. I set down my pack and started to unpack, trying to ignore the shadows growing longer around me. The forest was thick, the trees close together, and it was getting harder to see. I set up my tent as quickly as possible, double-checking the stakes and guy lines. The wind was picking up, rustling the branches and making eerie noises that played tricks on my mind. After eating a quick meal, I crawled into the tent. I was exhausted, my muscles sore, but I tried to stay alert. I could hear the forest around me, the occasional snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the distant sound of running water, but it all felt different in the fading light. The wind sounded louder, almost like it was moving through the trees in waves. I told myself it was normal, just the forest at night, but a part of me remained uneasy. I lay awake for hours, listening to the night sounds, the darkness pressing against the thin fabric of the tent. Around midnight, I was startled awake by a loud cracking noise. I froze, my heart hammering. It sounded like a large branch breaking somewhere close. I strained my ears, but I couldn't pinpoint the source. The wind had died down, so it was quiet now, except for my own rapid breathing. I debated whether to leave the tent and investigate, but I reminded myself that the forest at night was dangerous, and I needed to stay safe. I lay there for what felt like hours, waiting, tense, barely daring to breathe. The next morning, I woke early, the sky overcast and heavy. The wind had shifted, bringing cold air down the mountainside. I packed up quickly, eager to continue and put distance between myself and the uneasy night. The trail ahead was even steeper than the day before, and the mud from last week's rains had turned into slippery clay. I had to move slowly, careful not to fall. Around mid-morning, I heard the sound of rushing water growing louder. I followed it and discovered a small river cutting across the trail. The bridge that had been marked on my map was gone, swept away by recent floods. I considered trying to cross, but the current was strong, the water icy, and the rocks slippery. I looked around and realized there was no easy way across. I would have to backtrack several miles to find another crossing. My heart sank. This would set me back hours and force me to retrace part of the trail I had already fought to navigate. I turned back reluctantly, carefully retracing my steps over the treacherous trail. The forest felt heavier now, darker, almost suffocating in its density. My legs were screaming from the climb, my fingers numb from the cold, and my energy was low. By late afternoon, I had reached a point where the path widened slightly, but the sun was sinking fast, and I still had several miles to go to reach a proper campsite. I pushed on, hoping to find a safe spot before darkness fell. Then, as I rounded a bend, I saw something that froze me in place. The path ahead had collapsed, a landslide or erosion had taken out a large section, leaving a sheer drop of several feet. There was no way forward without risking a dangerous climb down and back up. I scanned the area, looking for an alternate route, but the forest on either side was thick and nearly impassable. Panic started to creep in. I was exhausted, low on food, and daylight was fading. I knew I couldn't stay here. There was nowhere safe to set up camp. I had to find another path, another way down the mountain. I remembered the map and realized there was a faint trail marked to the east that might bypass the blocked section. It was unmarked in real life, barely a path, but it was my only option. I turned in that direction, moving slowly, using my hands to push through thick undergrowth. The forest floor was uneven, covered in roots, rocks, and fallen branches. Every step was exhausting, but I had no choice. As the sky darkened, the forest became harder to navigate. I could barely see a few feet ahead. My headlamp provided a small circle of light, but shadows twisted in every direction. My heart raced, my muscles ached, and I began to feel disoriented. I realized I had no clear reference points, and the forest around me seemed endless. I stumbled several times, catching myself on branches and roots. My pack felt like it weighed a ton, and every movement sent shooting pain through my shoulders and back. At one point, I came to a small creek. There was no bridge, but the water was shallow enough that I could cross carefully. I took off my boots, tested the current with a stick, and waded through, my legs trembling. On the other side, I struggled to put my boots back on, my fingers stiff and numb. The cold had seeped into my bones, and I could feel fatigue threatening to overwhelm me. I kept moving, reminding myself that stopping here could be dangerous. Hours passed, or maybe it was only an hour. I lost track of time. My sense of direction wavered, and the forest seemed to close in around me. Then, finally, I noticed a faint glow ahead. I moved toward it cautiously and discovered a small logging road, partially overgrown, but unmistakably man-made. Relief washed over me like a wave. I followed the road slowly, every step cautious, until I reached a point where it intersected with a wider trail marked on my map. From there, I knew I was safe. I continued down the trail, which gradually became easier to navigate. By early morning, I reached a ranger station at the base of the mountain. Exhausted, mud-caked, and sore, I reported my position and received assistance. I had survived, and despite the fear and isolation, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The hike had pushed me beyond my limits, forced me to confront my fear and uncertainty, and taught me the importance of preparation and caution. I had learned to read the terrain, anticipate danger, and respect the power of the mountains. The forest that had seemed threatening and oppressive now felt alive with the memory of every step I had taken, every challenge I had overcome. I returned home with scars on my hands and legs, tired muscles, and a renewed appreciation for the fragility of life and the beauty of survival. Even weeks later, I could still feel the echo of that trail in my mind. The silence, the sudden dangers, the treacherous paths. But I also remembered the moments of triumph. Finding the logging road, the sense of relief and clarity when I finally reached safety, and the quiet pride of having faced the forest and come through intact. It was a hike I would never forget, not because it was easy or beautiful, but because it had tested every part of me and left me stronger, wiser, and deeply aware of both my limits and my resilience. I had been planning the hike for weeks. I wasn't the kind of person who needed crowds or guided tours. I liked isolation. Solitude made the mountains feel more alive. The weather report had promised clear skies, but I knew that in the wilderness, clear skies could change in minutes. I left my car at the trailhead early in the morning, before the sun had fully risen, so the world was still draped in that dim, gray light that makes every shape seem unfamiliar. The forest smelled damp, a mix of wet pine and decaying leaves. My pack was heavy with water, food, and emergency gear, but I carried it without complaint. This hike was supposed to be challenging, almost punishing, and I wanted to be ready. The first part of the trail was deceptively easy. The path was wide, the incline gentle, and the trees arched overhead like a natural cathedral. Birds sang intermittently, and a soft wind rustled the underbrush. I kept my pace steady, paying attention to the uneven ground, the loose stones, and the occasional roots that threatened to trip me. Every so often, I stopped to drink water and check my map. I had studied this trail extensively. It wasn't unknown, but it was remote enough that I wouldn't see another person for hours. By midday, the trail had narrowed. The trees were taller, their trunks thicker, and the forest denser. Sunlight barely reached the ground. The incline steepened gradually until I was forced to use my hands on some rocky sections. My legs burned, and my fingers ached from gripping the jagged surfaces. I didn't mind. I wanted this, The kind of fear I sought wasn't mythical. It was the fear of being in a place where a single mistake could mean serious injury or worse. As I climbed higher, I noticed subtle changes. The wind had picked up. Branches creaked and bent unnaturally. The underbrush was quieter. No birds, no rustling of small animals. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, almost suffocating. My heart began to beat a little faster, not from exertion, but from the sense that the forest itself was observing me. I tried to shake it off. Focus on your steps. Focus on your breathing. Around mid-afternoon, I reached a section where the trail crossed a steep ridge. Below, the slope dropped sharply into a valley blanketed in mist. The rocks underfoot were slick with moisture. I carefully inched along, testing each foothold before committing my weight. A single misstep here would not just bruise me. It could send me sliding down hundreds of feet. I was hyper-aware of every sound. The crunch of gravel under my boots, the occasional snap of a twig, even the distant roar of a waterfall somewhere deep in the forest. I stopped to rest at a small clearing halfway up the ridge. I drank water and ate a protein bar. My hands shook slightly, but I told myself it was from exertion. I scanned the surroundings. The forest seemed almost empty, yet I had a persistent feeling that I was not alone. Not in a human sense, but in the sense that the forest was alert. The shadows were longer now. The sunlight filtering through the canopy had turned golden, then orange. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and I pulled on a thin jacket. I resumed my climb. That's when I first noticed the footprints. At first, I thought they were my imagination. Faint impressions in the soft dirt beside the trail. Deep, irregular, not like any animal tracks I had seen. They were large, with an uneven stride. I followed them with my eyes for a few meters, but they disappeared as suddenly as they appeared. My stomach tightened. I told myself they were just a hiker who had passed through earlier, but the tracks were fresh. Too fresh. Pushing the thought aside, I continued upward. I wanted to reach the summit before dark. The trail became almost vertical in parts, requiring me to use metal anchors that had been embedded in the rock decades ago. The forest thinned here, replaced by jagged cliffs and sparse vegetation. The wind howled more insistently. I could feel it tugging at my pack, at my body, threatening to knock me off balance. Every step required careful attention. One wrong move could be catastrophic. Then the first incident occurred. A rock I had placed my foot on shifted. My heart jumped. I caught myself just in time with one hand on a nearby boulder, my other hand gripping the metal anchor. I swallowed hard, trying to calm my pounding heart. I looked down. The drop seemed impossible. I didn't want to imagine what would happen if I fell. My hands were sweaty, my boots slipping slightly on the wet stone. I realized that I had been climbing too quickly, trying to maintain a pace that my body was no longer suited for. I slowed down, testing every foothold with extreme caution. By late afternoon, the weather began to change. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, sudden and heavy. The wind screamed around me, pushing me against the cliffs. The first drops of rain fell, cold and insistent. The rock became slippery almost immediately. I realized that continuing upward was now dangerous. There was no safe place to wait out the storm at this altitude. My only option was to descend, but even that was treacherous. I started back down carefully, but my foot slipped on a slick patch of moss. I barely caught myself, my heart in my throat. The storm was intensifying. Rain pounded my jacket and helmet, and visibility dropped. I reached a narrow ledge that overlooked the valley. The mist had thickened, and I could barely see 20 feet ahead. The wind threatened to push me off balance again. I sat down, hugging my knees, trying to steady my breathing. I knew that if I didn't find solid footing soon, I could be trapped, exposed to the storm, and unable to descend safely. My phone had no signal. My GPS device had shut down earlier due to moisture. I was isolated in a way that felt utterly final. The storm lasted hours. I clung to that ledge, shivering, soaked, exhausted, but alive. At some point, the rain became a blur, the wind a deafening roar. I could see rocks tumbling below the cliffs, swept by the force of the storm. I kept reminding myself of every survival principle I had learned. Conserve energy, stay low to reduce exposure to wind, keep warm. I ate what little food I had left and rationed my water carefully. As night fell, the storm finally subsided. The rain slowed, leaving the rocks wet and dangerous, but the wind had calmed. I had survived the immediate threat, but the descent remained perilous. I waited until the first hint of dawn to continue. With the limited visibility, I moved slowly, testing each step. The morning brought weak sunlight, enough to see the contours of the trail. I kept close to the rock face, using every anchor and handhold. My legs screamed with fatigue. My hands were raw, but my determination never wavered. Hours later, I finally reached a more stable section of the trail. The forest was denser here, offering some protection from the elements. My pace was slow, almost painful, but the fear that had dominated the previous day had shifted into a focused determination. I kept moving. By late morning, I emerged onto a familiar ridge. The path leveled out, and I could see the trailhead in the distance, the tiny cars like toys far below. Relief washed over me in a wave so strong I almost stumbled. I had survived against exhaustion, isolation, exposure, and fear itself. When I finally reached my car, I was soaked, dirty, and bruised, but I was alive. I opened the door and sat inside, trembling slightly. I looked at my reflection in the window and barely recognized myself. Eyes wide, hair matted, face pale. The experience had left me shaken, but it had also left me profoundly aware of my own limits, of the raw power of the wilderness, and of the necessity of preparation, patience, and respect. I sat in silence for a long time, letting my body recover, grateful for the chance to continue another day. In the weeks that followed, I reflected on the hike repeatedly. It was the closest I had ever come to losing control over my own life, and it reminded me that the wilderness was not just beautiful. It was merciless. Every decision, every step mattered. I began planning future hikes with even more meticulous care, but I never lost my desire for solitude. The mountains were dangerous, yes, but they were also honest. They demanded respect, skill, and awareness. Looking back, I realized that what had made the hike truly terrifying was not the storm, the cliffs, or the isolation alone. It was the combination of everything. The relentless exposure to danger, the sudden changes in weather, the impossibility of calling for help, and the raw awareness of my own vulnerability. Yet, surviving that hike gave me an unexpected clarity. I understood my own resilience in a way I never had before. I had faced fear in its purest, most physical form, and I had endured it. The mountains had tested me and, in doing so, had given me a gift, an unshakable understanding of my own strength and limits. I would hike again, better prepared, still cautious, but with a newfound respect for both the dangers and the beauty of the wilderness. That day, I had walked on the edge of fear, and I had come back whole. It was a lesson in survival, in patience, and in the importance of preparation. And above all, it was a lesson in respect for the mountain, for nature, and for the fragility of life itself. I had been planning this hike for months, looking for a stretch of wilderness that was far from the usual trails. I wanted something remote, something that demanded respect, a place where the kind of danger that exists without being sensationalized could be felt. I had read the maps thoroughly, studied the terrain, and made sure my backpack had everything I might need. Food, water, a first aid kit, extra clothing, a small stove, navigation tools, and a headlamp. I told no one my exact plans, only that I was going for a long solo hike in the mountains. That decision, I would later realize, was a mistake. The morning I set out, the air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. My boots crunched over the frost-lined dirt trail, and the sun was just beginning to seep through the mist that hung over the forest. The trailhead was almost empty, just me and the sound of wind through the trees. I felt a strange mix of freedom and apprehension, an undercurrent of awareness that I couldn't place at first. But I told myself that the fear was just excitement. The The first few hours were routine. I followed the trail as it wound steeply upward, the ground becoming rockier, roots jutting out like hidden obstacles. The silence of the forest enveloped me, a deep, oppressive quiet, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. I made mental notes of landmarks, a large boulder shaped like a broken arch, a fallen tree with moss so thick it looked like a small hill, a stream with water so clear I could see the fish darting beneath the surface. Everything seemed ordinary, and yet my stomach twisted with unease, a physical sensation that told me I was alone in a place that was both beautiful and indifferent to my presence. By midday, I had climbed higher than I expected. The air grew thinner and colder, and I stopped more frequently to catch my breath. I filled my water bottle at a small waterfall and paused to eat some energy bars. That's when I noticed it. The trail markers were inconsistent. Small painted blazes on trees that guided hikers had become sporadic, then absent entirely. I checked my map and compass, trying to reconcile my position. According to the map, I should have reached a small plateau by now, but I was still climbing a narrow, rocky ridge. A flicker of unease, sharper than before, began to gnaw at me. I considered turning back, but something, I can't say what, urged me forward. Perhaps it was stubbornness or the excitement of exploring unclaimed territory. I pressed on. The trail narrowed even further, and the forest became denser, branches clawing at my jacket, thorns scratching my hands. The sunlight began to fade as clouds rolled in, and soon the mist thickened, reducing visibility to barely a few meters. Every sound seemed magnified. The snap of a twig, the whisper of the wind through needles, the distant echo of something rolling down a slope. I tried to focus, but the mind has a way of exaggerating small things when you are alone, and I felt the pull of fear like a tide rising around me. By late afternoon, I realized I was no longer on the trail. The landscape was alien. Jagged rocks, steep drops, and uneven ground with no discernible path. Panic began to creep in, subtle at first, then more persistent. I checked my compass. I was heading north, but that didn't reassure me. The map indicated that I should have descended onto a gentler slope hours ago. I felt a cold sweat settle on my back as the sun dipped lower. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, folding over the rocks like living things. The first real taste of fear settled in my chest, a heavy, insistent pressure. I stopped to assess my options. Going back seemed impossible. The path I had taken was too overgrown and indistinct to retrace confidently. Pushing forward felt like walking blind into something unknown. I knew my best chance of survival was to find higher ground and wait for clearer visibility, or until I could locate the plateau marked on the map. But with each step, the terrain worsened. Loose scree, hidden crevices, and sheer rock faces that demanded careful, deliberate movement. One misstep could be fatal. Hours passed. The mist thickened, transforming the familiar shapes of trees and rocks into grotesque shadows. I stumbled, cutting my hand on jagged rock, blood dripping down and mixing with the cold sweat on my palm. My backpack felt heavier with every step, my muscles screaming in protest. I began rationing water, realizing I had underestimated how long I would be out here. The sky turned an oppressive gray, and I felt the first drops of rain, cold and stinging. Night fell. Absolute darkness consumed everything beyond the reach of my headlamp. I stopped moving, crouching behind a large boulder that offered minimal shelter. The wind howled through the pines, carrying the smell of wet earth and something metallic, the scent of rusted iron or disturbed soil. I was exhausted, cold, and increasingly aware of how vulnerable I was. I considered making a fire but realized that the rain and the wind would make it nearly impossible. Every instinct screamed at me to stay quiet, to avoid drawing attention, but from what I couldn't tell, predators? Falling rocks? I didn't know, and that unknown was the most terrifying part. The night was endless. I huddled in my jacket, trying to conserve heat, listening to the sounds of the forest as they amplified in the dark. Every crack, every whisper of movement sent jolts of adrenaline through my body. At some point, I drifted into a fitful, uneasy sleep, waking to the sound of my own shivering. I couldn't tell how much time had passed, and I realized with dread that I had no way of knowing if anyone would come looking for me. I was truly alone, and the wilderness didn't care. Morning broke in a weak, gray light. The rain had stopped, leaving a mist that hung low over the rocks. Visibility improved slightly, enough to get my bearings. I made the decision to descend carefully, hoping that following the natural contours of the land would eventually lead me back to a recognizable trail. I moved slowly, deliberately, testing each foothold, aware that one slip could end everything. I was tired, hungry, and my body ached, but survival gave me focus. Every step became a negotiation between my fear and my determination. Hours later, my perseverance paid off. I spotted a small sign of human presence. A distant trail marker, weathered and half-broken, but unmistakable. Relief surged through me so violently that my body shook. I approached cautiously, ensuring I wasn't imagining it. The marker led to a faint path, barely visible, but it was the first solid indication that I was returning to civilization. I followed that path for what felt like an eternity, my legs weak, my hands scraped and swollen, my body screaming for rest. Eventually, the trail widened, trees thinned, and I saw the glint of a distant road through the thinning forest. My heart surged with hope, and tears mixed with the dirt and blood on my face as I quickened my pace. When I finally emerged onto the road, I collapsed, exhausted beyond measure, and felt the full weight of what had happened. The fear, the isolation, the relentless attention to detail required just to survive another hour. I was found later by a passing hiker who saw the flash of my bright jacket and called for help. I was dehydrated, bleeding from multiple small cuts, and hypothermic, but alive. In the weeks that followed, I recovered physically, though the memory of that hike never left me. I understood something crucial about nature that day. It is beautiful, indifferent, and brutally unforgiving. The wilderness does not care about preparation, maps, or experience. It only responds to presence and awareness. I learned to respect it in a way I never had before, to never underestimate the silent, slow power of being truly alone in a place that does not bend to human will. That hike left me changed. I still hike, still explore, but always with caution, respect, and humility. I no longer seek danger for the thrill of it. I seek understanding, the quiet knowledge that survival is never guaranteed, that the line between safety and catastrophe is often invisible until you step across it. That day, I crossed it, and I lived to learn from it. I carry that lesson with me in every step I take, in every forest I enter, in every mountain I climb, and I will never, ever take the simple act of walking on the earth for granted again. I had planned this hike for months, mapping out every detail, making lists of supplies, and checking the weather forecasts repeatedly. It was late summer, and the mountain range I chose was one of the most isolated in my region. I wanted solitude, a chance to disconnect completely from the noise of the city. My backpack was heavy but organized. Water bottles, extra clothing, first aid kit, map, compass, some snacks, and a flashlight tucked in the side pocket. The morning started calm and bright, the air crisp but warm with the sun climbing steadily in the sky. The trailhead was quiet. I remember feeling that familiar thrill of anticipation, the kind that makes your chest tight with excitement and a little fear all at once. The first few miles were easy. The trail wound through thick pine forests, sunlight filtering through the branches in a pattern of moving gold patches across the path. Birds chirped, and occasionally, a squirrel darted across the trail. I kept a steady pace, my boots crunching on the dirt and gravel. I stopped only to drink water, check my map, and adjust my backpack. By noon, I had reached a small clearing, where I sat on a fallen log to eat a snack. I could see the valley stretching below, rivers threading through it, and patches of farmland far in the distance. I felt completely alone, but not in a bad way. I liked it. After the clearing, the trail began to climb more steeply. The trees thinned, replaced by large boulders and rocky outcroppings. I had been warned that this section would be more challenging, and I was ready for it. My legs burned with exertion, and my breath came in short, sharp bursts. I paused occasionally to catch my breath and take in the views. The higher I climbed, the quieter the forest became. There were fewer birds, fewer signs of life. The wind picked up at times, whistling through the rocks in a way that sounded almost human. I dismissed the feeling of unease, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks, nothing more. By mid-afternoon, I was on the ridgeline. From here, I could see for miles in every direction. The trail was narrow, sometimes only a foot or two wide, with sheer drops on either side. I was careful with every step, planting my feet deliberately and keeping my backpack balanced. Then I noticed something strange. The trail markers had stopped appearing. The path I had been following seemed to disappear into a jumble of rocks. I checked my map. According to the topographical lines, the trail should continue, but I couldn't see it. I decided to backtrack a little, hoping to find the last marker I remembered. As I retraced my steps, I realized that the landscape was subtly changing in ways that made me uneasy. Some of the rocks had moved, or maybe I had not noticed them before. Small branches were broken, and I could see faint animal tracks in the dirt, fresh but unidentifiable. I felt a cold knot of fear in my stomach. I told myself to calm down, to think logically. I checked my compass and map carefully. I had been heading north, and my compass confirmed that I was still going roughly the right direction. But the trail itself had vanished. I kept walking cautiously, marking my path with small piles of stones, hoping I could find my way back if necessary. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, and shadows stretched long across the rocks. Suddenly, I slipped on loose gravel and slid a few feet down a steep incline. My heart raced as I caught myself on a small bush, my hands bleeding from the scrape. The adrenaline left me shaking, but I reminded myself that I was okay. I looked up and down the slope. There was no clear path. I decided to keep moving along the ridge, hoping it would eventually connect back to the main trail. My legs ached, my feet were sore, and I was sweating despite the cool air. I drank water, ate some more snacks, and tried to keep my mind focused. But the isolation was starting to weigh on me. There was no sound except the wind and my own breathing. Every rustle of a branch or small movement in the rocks made me jump. I realized that being alone in such a rugged area made every small sound feel like a threat. By late afternoon, clouds began to roll in. The sky turned gray, and the wind became sharper. I knew I needed to find shelter soon. I looked around for a flat area where I could safely stay the night if necessary. The ridge offered little, just steep inclines and jagged rocks. Finally, I spotted a small depression in the rock that might serve as a makeshift campsite. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than nothing. I dropped my pack, took a deep breath, and began to set up a small area for sleeping. I spread my emergency blanket on the ground, placed my backpack as a pillow, and arranged my supplies so I could reach them quickly. As night fell, the temperature plummeted. I shivered under my layers, the wind cutting through the ridge. I could hear distant echoes of rock slides or perhaps falling branches, and each one made my heart leap. I stayed alert, scanning the area with my flashlight when necessary. My mind was full of what-ifs. What if I slipped again? What if I couldn't find the trail in the morning? What if an animal came close? I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that I had survived hiking alone before. But this was different. This was isolated, higher up, and colder. I didn't sleep much. I kept my flashlight and a knife within reach, listening to the wind and the distant sounds of the mountain. Every small noise felt magnified. I kept imagining scenarios, some plausible, some ridiculous, but all terrifying in the moment. I had to force myself to stay calm, breathing deeply and focusing on small details. My hands, the rocks, my supplies. Anything that reminded me I was still here, still alive. When dawn came, I felt exhausted but slightly more confident. The light made everything visible again, and the shadows no longer played tricks on my eyes. I examined my map and compass carefully. I realized I had been slightly off course, veering east instead of north. I adjusted my route and began descending carefully. The rocks were slippery with morning dew, and my legs ached from tension and exhaustion. but I kept moving one careful step at a time. Hours later, I found a faint trail. It was partially overgrown but recognizable. My heart leapt with relief. I followed it slowly, checking my surroundings and making mental notes of landmarks. I saw a small stream and filled my water bottles, feeling a little more secure. My pace increased as the valley below came into view. By mid-afternoon, I was back in the forested section, where the trail was clear and familiar again. I could hear the distant hum of civilization, roads, cars, people. The relief was overwhelming. Eventually, I reached the trailhead. I was dirty, bruised, and exhausted, but I was safe. My body ached, but the fear and tension that had gripped me for the past 24 hours was finally lifting. I sat on a bench at the trailhead, resting and taking deep breaths, looking back at the ridge I had crossed. I realized how fragile the sense of safety was in the wilderness, how quickly confidence could turn into danger. The experience had been terrifying, but it had also reminded me of my resilience, my ability to stay calm, think clearly, and survive. I packed up my gear, checked my injuries, and began the drive back home. The city lights felt bright and comforting after the isolation of the mountains. I reflected on everything, the choices I had made, the moments of fear, the small victories that kept me moving. The hike had tested me physically and mentally, but I had emerged stronger, more aware, and grateful for the simple things. Solid ground, food, water, and the safety of other people nearby. That night, as I unpacked my gear at home, I carefully cleaned my cuts and bruises. I set my backpack aside, still a little heavy with supplies I hadn't used. I made a warm drink and sat in silence, thinking about what had happened. I realized that fear is a powerful teacher. It sharpens awareness, forces clarity, and demands focus. And sometimes the best way to confront fear is not to avoid it, but to move through it, step by step, even when every part of your body and mind is screaming to stop. I slept well that night, deeply and without interruption. I knew I had learned something important, not just about hiking, but about survival, preparation, and the strength I carry inside. The mountains had been harsh, unforgiving, and scary, but they had not defeated me. I had faced the challenge, endured it, and come out whole. And that clarity, that sense of safety and accomplishment, stayed with me long after the trail and the ridge were far behind. I had been planning this hike for months, obsessively studying maps, topographic lines, and trail reviews. The trail I chose was remote, barely marked, and in the northern range of the Rockies. I wanted a challenge, something that would push me physically and mentally, and perhaps give me a sense of solitude I hadn't felt in years. The morning I left, the sky was a pale gray, heavy with the promise of rain. My pack felt heavier than usual, but I didn't mind. I had loaded it carefully: food, water, a first aid kit, extra layers, a small stove, and a satellite phone. I felt prepared. I had to. The first few hours were pleasant in the way that early hiking can be pleasant. The path was steep, lined with dense pine trees that smelled faintly of resin and wet earth. The ground was uneven, roots protruding here and there, slick with last night's rain. I moved slowly, deliberately, watching every step. There were streams to cross, shallow but fast-moving, their cold water lapping over my boots, numbing my toes. My legs were sore, muscles straining with every step, but the adrenaline of being alone in the wilderness kept me moving. By midday, the clouds had thickened, dropping a fine mist that blurred the distant peaks. The trail narrowed, twisting along a ridge that sloped sharply down on one side. The rocks were wet and unstable, and I had to grip trees and roots to keep my balance. A few times, I slipped slightly, my heart jumping as I managed to catch myself. Each time, I reminded myself to stay calm, to breathe slowly, and to focus on each step. Panic would get me killed here. Around mid-afternoon, the mist turned into drizzle. My jacket soaked through despite its waterproofing, and the temperature dropped sharply. I felt the first real chill of the day, deep in my bones. The trail became less distinct, littered with fallen branches and mud. I had to step carefully to avoid ankle-twisting rocks hidden beneath the detritus. At one point, I noticed the trail disappearing entirely, the path ahead just a slope of slick stones and wet moss. I hesitated. My heart raced, not with excitement now, but with a subtle, creeping fear. This wasn't just a hard hike. This was isolation, exposure, and danger all wrapped into one. I forced myself to move forward, sliding carefully over the rocks, hands braced on anything solid. I checked my GPS. It said I was still on the trail, though I doubted it. The mist made everything look the same, and landmarks I had studied were obscured. I felt an odd mixture of thrill and dread, that precise fear that makes a person hyper-aware, yet physically tense. Every sound seemed amplified. The drip of water from pine needles, the occasional snap of a branch, the distant rumble of falling rocks. My mind kept telling me this was normal, that the forest made noises, but a part of me whispered otherwise. By late afternoon, the drizzle had turned to steady rain. My boots squelched with every step. My clothes clung to my skin. I realized I hadn't eaten much, distracted by keeping balance and moving forward. My hands were stiff from the cold, making it harder to grip rocks and roots. I had passed any practical markers for rest, and the trail ahead seemed even more treacherous. I started calculating distances, trying to decide if I could push on or needed to set up a temporary shelter. I didn't want to stop too early, or I'd be stranded in the dark, and I didn't want to push too far and exhaust myself. Every choice felt like a calculation between survival and danger. Around 5 p.m., I came to a narrow gorge, a steep drop on one side and a jagged rock wall on the other. A stream ran down the middle, swollen with the rain. There was no bridge, no shallow place to cross, only slick boulders and rushing water. I studied the stones, testing their stability with my foot, but each one moved slightly, threatening to tip. I realized I had a choice: backtrack a mile to a safer crossing, or attempt a dangerous scramble across the wet boulders. The risk was high, but I was already exhausted from hours of hiking and didn't want to lose more daylight retracing my steps. I took a deep breath, focused every muscle, and began crossing. Halfway across, my boot slipped on a mossy rock. My hand grasped at nothing but wet air, my body twisting. I caught myself against the rock wall, heart hammering. My palms were raw, fingers bleeding slightly from the friction. My legs scraped across a sharp stone. I froze for a moment, leaning against the wall, chest heaving. I considered turning back, but the thought of nightfall, of descending in near darkness, made my body tense with urgency. I pushed forward, slow and careful, inching across the stream until finally, I was on the far side, drenched, bruised, and shaking. The trail beyond the gorge was a narrow ledge along the mountainside, barely wide enough for one person. The rain was relentless, and I had to crouch at times to avoid slipping down the slope. I kept glancing up and down, calculating every step. The adrenaline was a mix of fear and fatigue, an intoxicating and dangerous combination. I knew that one misstep could be fatal. Every muscle screamed in protest. Every joint ached. My vision blurred from rain and exhaustion, but I forced myself to move. Night was approaching fast. The mist had thickened again, almost completely obscuring the surrounding mountains. I realized I had misjudged my timing. I would not make it back to the main trail before darkness. The thought of descending this slippery path without daylight made my stomach tighten. I searched for a place to stop, a ledge or flat rock, somewhere I could rest and regain composure. I found a small overhang, just enough to sit without sliding down. I dumped my pack and tried to calm myself. My hands shook violently as I took off my wet gloves, attempting to wring some warmth back into my fingers. The night came quickly, faster than I expected. The rain hadn't let up, and the temperature dropped sharply. I wrapped myself in every layer I had, huddling against the rock wall, shivering uncontrollably. My feet were wet, boots full of muddy water, toes numb and painful. I tried to eat a small snack, but the dampness made it taste like mud. My body ached from hours of tension and exertion. I realized I was facing a critical decision: stay put and wait out the storm, or attempt a dangerous descent in near total darkness. Every option carried risk. I had studied mountain survival, read countless accounts, but nothing fully prepares you for the raw reality of being alone, soaked, exhausted, and cold in a remote place. I decided to wait, hoping the storm would ease. I wrapped myself in my rain jacket and poncho, trying to conserve heat. Time passed agonizingly slowly. I listened to the rain hammering on rock and needles, to the water rushing in unseen streams, to the occasional crack of a distant rockslide. My mind oscillated between fear and determination, anxiety and calculation. I mentally rehearsed the descent I would have to make when the storm lessened, tracing every step in my mind, imagining the safest paths, the securest handholds, the places I could pause to rest. I tried not to think of the worst-case scenarios, but they hovered anyway, sharp and cold, like needles. Hours passed, and gradually, the rain lessened. The mist began to lift, revealing the jagged edges of the mountains, the steep drops I had been so carefully avoiding. My body was numb and stiff, but I felt a spark of hope. I packed my meager supplies, wrung out what I could of my wet clothes, and began the cautious descent. Every step required full attention. The trail was treacherous, rocks slick, roots slicker. I used my hands constantly, sometimes crawling on all fours to maintain balance. The descent took hours. Darkness had fallen completely by the time I reached the lower slopes, but the occasional flash of lightning earlier had left enough residual light for me to navigate cautiously. My legs screamed, my back ached, but I kept moving. Eventually, I reached the treeline. The dense forest below offered more solid footing, though obstacles remained. Fallen branches, mud, and undergrowth slowed me, but I could move faster here than on the cliffs. I began following a faint game trail, one that seemed to lead downward toward a river valley I remembered from my map. My GPS showed I was near the river, and I focused on that small, achievable goal. The thought of warmth, dry clothes, and safety fueled my steps, despite the pain in every muscle. After what felt like an eternity, I finally reached the river. The sound of rushing water, which had been threatening from a distance, now seemed welcoming. I found a dry bank and collapsed, utterly exhausted. My clothes were soaked, my body bruised and aching, but I had made it. I used my stove to heat some water, sipping slowly, savoring the warmth that spread through my chilled body. My hands, still shaking, clutched the mug as if it were a lifeline. I took off my boots, wringing out the water, and wrapped myself in dry layers I had packed just for emergencies. The next day, the storm had passed, leaving clear skies and sunlight that made the forest look almost beautiful, though I still felt raw and shaken. I followed the river downstream, careful to avoid slippery rocks and sudden drops, until I reached a maintained trail. Signs of human presence, footprints, trail markers, were a relief almost as strong as warmth or food. I continued along this safer path until I emerged at a ranger station. My relief was immense. I was wet, sore, bruised, but alive. My experience had been terrifying, a relentless test of endurance, caution, and resolve, but I had made it through. In the end, the hike had not gone as planned. I had underestimated the trail, the weather, and the sheer difficulty of navigating in such remote terrain. But I had survived, learned more about my limits than I ever could in comfort, and gained a profound respect for the mountains and the dangers they conceal. As I sat by the ranger station, drying my clothes in the sun, I promised myself I would return one day, but only after much more preparation, careful planning, and respect for the wilderness that had nearly claimed me. That hike had been a terrifying lesson in humility, caution, and perseverance, one I would carry with me forever. I had been planning this hike for months, studying maps, reading trail reports, and making a checklist of all the gear I thought I might need. The area I chose was remote, not the usual tourist trail, but a stretch of mountains that only seasoned hikers often attempted. It promised solitude, untouched nature, and the chance to test my limits. I wanted to be completely alone, away from the noise of cars, phones, and other people, to experience the kind of quiet that makes you acutely aware of every movement, every sound, every change in the wind. I also knew that being alone in the wilderness carried risks, but I had done other hikes, and I believed I was prepared. I started early in the morning, carrying a pack that was heavier than usual, stuffed with extra water, food, a first aid kit, emergency blankets, a flashlight, a detailed map, and a compass. My boots were well worn in but sturdy, and I had layered clothing for the unpredictable mountain weather. The trailhead was quiet, with only the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of birds as the sun broke over the horizon. I could feel the cool morning air filling my lungs, a mix of damp earth, pine, and the faint scent of wildflowers. The first hours of the hike were uneventful, almost serene. I moved slowly, deliberately, keeping my pace steady to conserve energy for the steep climbs ahead. The trail wound through dense pine forests, with thick roots and rocks underfoot that made every step a careful negotiation. The sun gradually rose higher, casting long shadows through the trees and highlighting the rough texture of bark and moss. Every so often, a small animal would dart across the path. Squirrels, birds, the occasional deer, but mostly, it was silent except for the sound of my breathing and the crunch of my boots on the dirt. Around midday, the terrain began to change. The forest thinned, giving way to exposed rocky sections where the trail clung to steep slopes. I could see the valley below, a patchwork of greens and browns stretching into the distance, and the wind picked up, cooler and sharper at this altitude. I paused often, not just to catch my breath, but to take in the view and check my map. I was following the main trail, but there were smaller, barely visible tracks branching off, and I made sure to avoid them. As I climbed higher, the trail became more treacherous. Loose rocks shifted under my weight, and the incline grew steeper. My legs ached, and my heart pounded harder with each step, but the air was crisp and invigorating. I was alert to every sound: the crack of a branch under a distant animal's weight, the whistle of wind through crevices, the occasional echo that seemed too close for comfort. I reminded myself to focus on the trail and not let my imagination wander. It was during one of these steeper sections, mid-afternoon, that I noticed something unusual. Ahead, the trail seemed oddly disturbed. Rocks that had been stable were now shifted, small branches snapped or bent, as if something or someone had passed through. I paused and studied the marks. They were recent. The soil was still soft in spots, and the edges of the broken twigs hadn't dried. My heart rate picked up slightly, though I told myself it could be an animal or a hiker who had gone by earlier. Still, a subtle tension settled in my shoulders. I pressed on, trying to keep my mind focused on the trail, but the feeling of being watched persisted. The forest canopy was thinning, allowing more light, yet it also made me more visible in the open stretches. I reached a narrow ridge where the trail was barely wide enough for one person. The slope dropped sharply on both sides, and the wind was stronger, tugging at my clothes and backpack. I paused at a point where the ridge offered a clear view of the distant peaks. The view was breathtaking, but a gnawing sense of unease lingered. I noticed fresh footprints in the dirt. They were human shoe prints larger than mine, heading in the same direction I was going. My stomach tightened. I couldn't be sure if they were hours old or more recent. I checked my surroundings carefully. There was no one in sight. The ridge was silent, except for the wind and the distant call of a bird. I considered turning back but dismissed the idea. I had come too far, and the trail continued up, eventually leading to a higher plateau I intended to reach before nightfall. I continued, but the sense of isolation grew heavier. The wind carried odd noises, rocks falling, branches snapping, but there was no one there when I looked. I kept telling myself it was the terrain and animals, but each sound made my heart jump. I slowed my pace, paying attention to every movement, and began scanning the trail ahead and behind more frequently. As late afternoon approached, the trail became a jumble of rocks, roots, and steep drops. I climbed cautiously, using my hands when necessary, gripping rocks for balance. My muscles ached, and fatigue was creeping in, but I maintained focus. Then, without warning, I heard a loud crack above me, a rock dislodging from higher up, and it tumbled down the slope, landing not far from my feet with a violent crash. I froze, adrenaline surging, my pulse hammering. Another rock fell, and I realized the slope above was unstable. A landslide or a larger rockfall could be imminent. I decided to move quickly but carefully. My steps were deliberate, choosing the most stable footholds, my eyes scanning constantly. The wind howled more strongly now, pushing against me, and I could hear the faint rumble of shifting rocks above. I tried to think clearly. There was no safe way to outrun a rockfall, so my only option was to move along the trail as efficiently as possible while avoiding loose stones. Every muscle in my body tensed, my mind laser-focused on each movement. After what felt like hours but was likely only half an hour, the rocky section ended, giving way to a narrow plateau with a small grove of trees. I dropped my pack carefully and sank to the ground, trying to calm my racing heart. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the plateau. I drank water, ate a bit of trail mix, and took stock of my position. I wasn't lost. I still had the map and compass, and the main trail continued toward the ridge I had aimed to reach. But I realized something. I had underestimated how isolated this area was. If anything went wrong, help could be hours, maybe even a day away. I pressed on, choosing a route along the less steep edge of the plateau. My legs were heavy, my feet sore, but I forced myself to maintain a steady pace. The terrain alternated between small patches of scrub and exposed rock. I was hyper-aware of every sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant crack of shifting stones, the occasional echo that seemed to follow me. Hours passed, and the sun sank lower, painting the mountains in golden orange and deepening shadows. By early evening, I reached the base of a larger rise that would lead to the final stretch before the summit. The light was fading quickly. I calculated the remaining distance and realized that I had underestimated the time it would take. I needed to set up a temporary camp before dark. I found a small area protected by rocks, level enough for my emergency blanket and backpack, and I settled in, trying to make myself as comfortable as possible. The wind was biting now, and I added layers, wrapping my blanket around myself. Night fell fully, and the forest transformed. Shadows merged into darkness, and every small sound was amplified. I lay still, listening, heart pounding at every rustle. I knew there was no danger from ghosts or fairy tales, only the real hazards. The terrain, exposure, fatigue, and perhaps the presence of other people with unknown intentions. My mind played tricks, turning ordinary noises into threats, but I kept reminding myself of reality. Around midnight, I was woken by a distinct sound, movement. Something or someone was walking nearby. I stayed as still as possible, straining to see in the darkness. The wind carried the sound, making it impossible to tell direction. My first instinct was to freeze, my second was to prepare for flight if necessary. I reached for my flashlight but didn't turn it on, knowing it would reveal my position. The sound moved along the perimeter of my temporary shelter. Footsteps, deliberate, heavy, too consistent for an animal. My stomach sank. I stayed motionless, listening, waiting for it to pass. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Finally, the movement stopped. I didn't dare move immediately, fearing any sudden action could provoke a dangerous encounter. I held my breath, listening to the fading rustle of leaves. Eventually, silence returned, punctuated only by the wind. I waited until the first light of dawn before cautiously peeking over the rocks. No one was there. I scanned the surrounding area, checking for signs of tracks or disturbances. The ground showed faint footprints leading away from my camp. Relief washed over me, but I remained wary. Morning light brought a sense of calm. I packed up quickly, keeping my senses alert, and resumed the climb. The trail was still steep, but visibility was better. I took careful steps, noting landmarks, and using the map and compass to stay on track. The ridge I had aimed for was visible in the distance, and with the sun rising higher, I could see the terrain more clearly. By midday, I reached the summit. The view was breathtaking, a reward that made every challenge and fear worthwhile. I could see valleys, ridges, and forests stretching for miles. The air was thinner here, cooler, and the wind blew sharply against my face. I sat down to rest, eat, and drink, letting the adrenaline of the previous day and night slowly subside. I took in every detail: the texture of the rocks beneath my hands, the color of the trees below, the movement of birds across the open sky. After spending time at the summit, I began my descent along a different route I had studied before the hike. The way down was still challenging, but I was more experienced now, more cautious, and more aware of the hazards. I moved steadily, avoiding loose rocks and steep edges, marking landmarks mentally to maintain orientation. The sun was higher, providing better visibility, and the trail was clearer than the night before. By late afternoon, I reached a lower elevation where the terrain became gentler, the forest thickening again. I felt a sense of accomplishment and relief. I was tired, sore, and mentally drained, but I was safe. The isolation, the fear, the uncertainty, all of it had tested me in ways I had not anticipated. But I had made it through, relying on preparation, focus, and caution. Eventually, I reached the trailhead where I had started. My car was parked exactly where I left it, the keys still in the ignition. I sat for a moment, letting the silence and the memory of the hike sink in. I realized the experience had changed something inside me. I had confronted real danger, not supernatural fears, but the unpredictability of nature and human presence in remote wilderness. I had learned that preparation, vigilance, and patience could carry you through the most unsettling situations. The drive home was quiet. I replayed the events in my mind: the narrow ridge, the rockfall, the night of footsteps, and the climb to the summit. Each memory was vivid, and yet each was a testament to endurance and careful decision-making. By the time I reached my house, I was exhausted but grounded, with a clear understanding that the wilderness commands respect, and that survival depends on preparation, awareness, and calm under pressure. I unpacked my gear, cleaned my boots, and laid everything out. I documented the trip in my notebook, noting trail conditions, hazards, and lessons learned. It was a hike that could have ended very differently, but it ended with clarity, accomplishment, and a deep appreciation for the unforgiving beauty of nature. I knew I would return to these mountains one day, but with the knowledge and caution that comes only from facing fear and surviving it. I had been planning the hike for months, ever since I discovered the trail on an old map tucked into a guidebook at the local library. It was a remote, rugged route through the northern mountains, far away from the usual tourist trails. The appeal was simple: isolation, challenge, and the raw beauty of untamed wilderness. I knew I was stepping into a place where even small mistakes could have serious consequences, but I felt ready. I had been hiking for years, had navigated difficult terrains before, and I was confident in my ability to handle myself. I packed carefully, checking and rechecking my gear, making sure I had enough water, food, a first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries, and a map with a compass. I also carried a small emergency satellite beacon just in case. The morning of the hike started clear and cold. The sky was a pale blue, the sun low on the horizon, casting long, sharp shadows across the jagged peaks. I parked my car at the trailhead and took a moment to adjust my backpack, feeling its familiar weight settle onto my shoulders. The air smelled of pine and wet earth, and the only sounds were the distant calls of birds and the crunch of dry leaves under my boots. I had the trail to myself. The first several hours went smoothly. The path was steep but manageable, winding along ridges and through dense forests. I moved slowly, deliberately, taking care to place each foot securely, especially over loose rocks. I stopped occasionally to drink water, check my bearings, or just admire the view. From the ridge tops, the valleys below stretched endlessly, a mix of dark green forests and pale, rocky slopes. It was beautiful in a way that made you feel both small and alive, a kind of sharp, quiet wonder. Around midday, the trail began to narrow. Tall firs and hemlocks pressed close to either side, their shadows forming dark strips across the path. The terrain became uneven, with exposed roots and rocks jutting out in every direction. My legs were tiring, my feet aching, but I felt a thrill at being in a place so far from the usual paths. I reminded myself to keep steady, to maintain focus. That's when I first noticed the signs. Small things at first: broken branches, footprints in the soft dirt, the distant sound of snapping twigs. I had been alone, but something about the spacing and depth of the footprints made me pause. They didn't look like animal tracks. They were human, heavy, uneven, fresh. My stomach tightened. I told myself it was probably another hiker who had gone ahead. But the trail was deserted. No other cars, no signs of anyone else starting the hike that morning. Still, I pressed on. Hours passed, and the trail became increasingly difficult. A sudden, steep descent forced me to slide carefully over loose scree and rocks, keeping my balance with my hiking poles. The shadows lengthened, and I realized the sun was already lower than I had thought. I didn't want to be caught on the steep parts in the dark, but I told myself I had enough daylight to make it to my intended camp spot. That confidence felt foolish as I entered a narrow canyon where the trail disappeared under thick brush. I stopped and tried to retrace my path in my mind, checking the map, comparing the shapes of the mountains to the contour lines. Something felt off. The canyon narrowed even more, and I realized I hadn't seen any markers for quite some time. I should have passed a small creek by now, but there was nothing. No water, no rocks that looked familiar, no sounds other than my own breathing and the faint rustle of the wind. Panic flickered, a small, sharp flame in my chest, but I forced it down. I had trained for emergencies. I had a plan. I decided to climb to higher ground, hoping to see the canyon open up or find the trail again. Every step was slow and careful. Loose rocks shifted under my boots, and the slope was steeper than it looked from below. Halfway up, I slipped. My backpack hit the ground, knocking the wind out of me, and I scraped my forearm on a jagged rock. Pain flared, sharp and immediate. I stopped, breathing hard, assessing the injury. It was bleeding, but not dangerously. I cleaned it as best I could with water from my bottle and applied a small bandage. It was late afternoon by the time I reached the top of the ridge. From there, I could see the canyon stretching below me, a dark, narrow corridor that seemed to twist and vanish into the distance. My intended path lay somewhere down there, but the route was unclear, overgrown, and treacherous. I realized with a sinking feeling that I had lost the trail. I weighed my options. Going down into the canyon in fading light seemed dangerous. Staying put meant spending the night on a ridge with no proper shelter. The sky was beginning to turn shades of pink and orange, the light fading quickly. I remembered my emergency beacon and my map. I considered my location, trying to triangulate where I might be. I decided to set up a temporary camp. I found a relatively flat section of ground, cleared rocks and sticks, and laid out my sleeping pad and bivy sack. I ate a small portion of food and drank water, trying to conserve supplies for the night. Night came quickly. Darkness pressed in from all sides, the mountains towering over me. I could hear strange noises, rocks falling somewhere in the distance, the low groan of the wind, animals moving unseen. Each sound made my heart jump. I tried to calm myself, focusing on breathing, thinking logically, assessing risks. I didn't panic. I checked my flashlight and batteries, made sure my phone and beacon were accessible. Hours passed. I didn't sleep much. The cold bit through my clothing, and every sound made me tense. I thought about the decision I had made to leave the canyon and stay high. In the back of my mind, I knew it was the safer choice. At some point, the sounds faded, and exhaustion overtook my fear. I dozed lightly, waking at intervals, disoriented by the wind and shadows. Morning came slowly, pale light washing over the ridges. I packed up, carefully descending to try and find the trail again. The terrain was treacherous, but daylight revealed details I had missed. Faint blazes on trees, the edge of a trail hidden by fallen branches. I followed these carefully, my confidence growing with each step. Hours passed, but I stayed on the trail this time. I remained vigilant, scanning every corner, every shadow. By late afternoon, I emerged into a small valley I recognized from my map, and relief washed over me. I had regained the path. I could see a distant parking area where I had planned to exit. I forced myself to move quickly, ignoring the aches in my legs, the exhaustion in my body. By evening, I reached the trailhead. The relief was overwhelming. I checked my watch. Almost 24 hours had passed since I had started. I had been alone, disoriented, and close to real danger, but I had made it. My car, parked and untouched, felt like a sanctuary. I sat for a moment, letting the exhaustion and tension drain from me. My body ached, my arms and legs stiff, but the sense of safety, of having survived, was powerful. Later, I reflected on what had happened. The experience had been terrifying, yes, but it had also been a lesson in preparation, caution, and patience. I had carried the right equipment, stayed calm under pressure, and made decisions based on logic, not fear. I knew I would hike again, but I also knew I would respect the wilderness more, never underestimate its difficulty, and never assume that a trail was simple or safe just because it looked familiar on a map. The hike had changed me, taught me humility, endurance, and the importance of vigilance. It had been a brush with danger that was real, tangible, and utterly human. I had navigated isolation, injury, and fear and emerged on the other side. I had faced the wilderness, faced myself, and survived. And when I finally drove away from the trailhead, the mountains receding behind me, I knew I had earned a deeper understanding of both the fragility and resilience of human life. I had been planning this solo hiking trip for months. The area I chose was a remote mountain range, one of those places that felt untouched and wild, where trails were faint, maps were unreliable, and cell service was a luxury. I wanted to escape everything: the noise of the city, the constant demands of work, the endless responsibilities. I wanted nothing but the sound of my boots on the dirt, the wind brushing past my face, the smell of wet pine needles, and the quiet pulse of the forest. I didn't think much about the risks. I had hiked before and I knew the basics. I carried a small backpack with the essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, a compass, a headlamp, a knife, extra clothing, and a light tent. I told no one exactly where I was going. I wanted solitude, and I had convinced myself that this mountain, though rugged and isolated, would be manageable. The first day of hiking was perfect. The sky was clear and blue, the sunlight filtered through the tall pine trees, and the forest smelled clean and earthy. The trail was narrow but visible, marked here and there with faded paint on trees. I kept a steady pace, stopping every so often to drink water, stretch, and take pictures. I recorded everything in my mind: the sound of a small creek trickling over rocks, the occasional bird call, the crunch of pine needles beneath my boots. I camped near a ridge that evening, setting up my tent in a small clearing. The sun was setting behind the peaks, and the sky turned brilliant shades of orange and pink. I sat on a rock, drinking water and listening to the wind rustle the branches above. That night, I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the peaceful sounds of the forest. The next morning, I packed my gear and continued deeper into the mountains. The trail grew steeper, rockier, and harder to follow. The path narrowed in places to a thin strip between cliffs and dense underbrush. I reminded myself to be careful and to conserve my energy. My legs ached slightly, but the adrenaline of the wilderness kept me moving. By mid-afternoon, I had reached a small plateau with a view of a valley below. The sun was high, warm on my back, and I took a long break, eating some trail mix and drinking water. It was during this break that I realized something. The path markers had become sparse. I tried to remember the map I had studied, but the terrain was more confusing than I expected. Small ridges, boulders, and patches of dense trees blocked my line of sight. I noted the general direction and decided to follow the faint tracks in the dirt, assuming they were part of the trail. As I continued, the sun began to dip behind the mountains. Shadows stretched long across the ground, and the forest darkened in a way that made every rustle and movement seem amplified. I could no longer see the faint trail markers, and the dirt tracks became irregular and confusing. I realized that I had misjudged the trail and might have strayed off the main path. Panic started to creep in. I stopped and pulled out my compass, trying to orient myself. According to my calculations, I had been moving east, but the dense forest made everything look the same. I considered turning back, but there were no obvious landmarks, and I had no idea how far I had gone. I decided to push forward slowly, keeping the compass in front of me, hoping to find a recognizable clearing or ridge. By the time the sun set completely, the forest became a wall of darkness. My headlamp cast a weak cone of light, illuminating only a few feet ahead. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made my heart beat faster. I could hear the wind through the trees and the distant sound of running water, which gave me some orientation. I stumbled over roots and rocks, and my legs grew heavier with fatigue. I realized I had not drunk enough water and my stomach grumbled in hunger. I tried to eat a few nuts and sip water, but my hands were shaking. Hours passed like this, and I felt a creeping sense of isolation. I knew that if I stayed where I was, I could freeze or get dehydrated, but moving blindly in the dark was dangerous. At some point, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. My first thought was another hiker, but when I froze and listened, the sounds stopped. Then they resumed intermittently, always just out of sight. My mind raced through possibilities. Was it a wild animal? A lost hiker? Or just my imagination? The logical part of me knew the forest was full of creatures like deer or coyotes, but my instincts screamed danger. I picked up my pace, trying to put distance between myself and the sound, but the terrain was difficult. I slipped on a wet rock, scraping my arm and knee. Pain shot through me, but I ignored it, forcing myself to move. Eventually, I reached a small clearing. The moon had risen high, and its cold, silvery light filtered through the trees. I considered camping there, but I realized that the ground was uneven and sloped, making it difficult to pitch my tent. I remembered the creek I had heard earlier and decided to follow the sound, hoping it would lead to a familiar landmark or the main trail. As I approached, the sound of running water became louder, and I spotted the glimmer of a stream. I followed it, keeping as close as possible without slipping into the water. The terrain was muddy, and my boots sank in places. I tried to stay calm and steady my breathing. Hours passed. The stream wound through the forest, sometimes shallow and easy to cross, sometimes deep and swift. At one point, I slipped on a moss-covered rock and twisted my ankle. Sharp pain shot through my foot, and I nearly fell into the water. I had to stop, breathe, and assess the injury. My ankle was swollen and tender, and every step caused pain. I realized that hiking with an injured ankle in the dark would be nearly impossible, but I also knew that staying in one place could be dangerous. The temperature had dropped, and my clothes were damp from sweat and splashes from the stream. I had to keep moving to stay warm. I forced myself to continue, limping along the stream. Eventually, I came across a narrow, fallen log that served as a bridge across a wider section. The log was slick, and I had to balance carefully. Halfway across, my foot slipped, and I grabbed the nearest branch for support. My heart pounded, adrenaline surged, and I made it across, but I knew one misstep could have been fatal. After what felt like endless hours, I finally spotted a faint light ahead. My hope surged, thinking it was a campsite or a ranger station. I moved faster, limping but determined. As I drew closer, I realized it was a small fire pit in a clearing, abandoned but recently used. Nearby were signs of a trail. My relief was immense. I had found something familiar, an anchor point. I decided to camp near the clearing for the night. I set up my small tent, wrapped myself in layers, and tried to rest. Sleep came fitfully, but the safety of some open space and the knowledge that I was back on some form of trail helped. The next morning, I assessed my options. My ankle was swollen but manageable. I carefully followed the faint trail markers, moving slowly and deliberately. By midday, I reached a wider trail, clearly used by other hikers. Relief washed over me as I recognized familiar signage. I continued along the main trail, moving slowly to protect my ankle. By evening, I emerged from the forest onto a dirt road used by park rangers and hikers. I followed the road and eventually reached a small ranger station. They looked at me with concern, noting my scraped arms, swollen ankle, and disheveled appearance. I explained, without much detail, that I had gotten lost in the mountains and had been hiking alone. They gave me water, medical supplies, and a place to rest. Later, they took me back to the main parking area where I had left my car. I sat in the driver's seat, exhausted, dehydrated, and sore, but immensely relieved. I realized how close I had come to serious injury or worse. I reflected on the experience, the beauty of the mountains, the thrill of isolation, but also the dangers of underestimating terrain, losing a trail, or hiking alone without notifying anyone. I promised myself that I would never take such risks again without proper preparation and communication. The experience left a lasting impression. I became more cautious, more respectful of the wilderness, and more aware of my limits. I returned home safely, grateful for the lessons learned and the clear, tangible reminder that nature is beautiful but unforgiving. From that day on, I planned every hike meticulously, always letting someone know my route and expected return, carrying proper gear, and maintaining a heightened awareness of my surroundings. I had always loved hiking, the kind that left you sore, hungry, and entirely exhausted at the end of the day. There was a raw satisfaction in pushing my body and being surrounded by wild nature, far from the noise and light of the city. That spring, I decided to tackle a trail I had read about online, one that led through a densely wooded mountain region, over steep ridges, and past a few isolated lakes. The area was remote, and I liked it that way. The reviews mentioned that it was not well traveled, and the sense of isolation was exactly what I wanted. I prepared carefully. Backpack loaded with enough food for 3 days, water filters, a compact stove, extra layers of clothing, first aid kit, flashlight, and a detailed map of the trails. My phone had service at the trailhead, but I knew it would die quickly as I went deeper into the mountains, so I didn't rely on it beyond navigation. The first day went smoothly. The trail started at a narrow gravel road that curved up into the forest, with sunlight filtering through thick green leaves and the distant murmur of a stream nearby. I moved slowly, taking note of every twist and turn in the path, every marker painted on trees or rocks, and every stream crossing. The trail was steep in places, but nothing unmanageable. The air was fresh and crisp, scented with pine and wet earth. Birds called out from high branches, and occasionally I would spot a deer slipping silently between the trees. I made it to the first lake by late afternoon, a small, clear pool surrounded by rocks and dense underbrush. I set up my small tent on a flat patch of ground nearby, cooked a simple meal, and watched the sun dip behind the ridges. By nightfall, the woods were alive with sounds: the chirp of crickets, the occasional call of an owl, and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I fell asleep feeling calm and satisfied. The next morning, I packed up early. The trail climbed sharply after the lake, winding up a ridge where the trees thinned, leaving rocky outcrops and steep drops on either side. I was alone and aware of it, but it never made me nervous. I had done enough solo hikes to trust my instincts and my preparation. By midday, I reached a narrow saddle between two peaks. The view was stunning. Rolling mountains stretching endlessly in every direction, dark green valleys, and rivers glinting in the sun. I took a short break, drinking water and eating a handful of trail mix, then continued down the ridge toward the next valley. That was when I noticed something strange. A faint smell, almost chemical, carried by the wind. It wasn't strong enough to be alarming, but it was unusual. I shrugged it off, assuming it was from some nearby industry or farm far off the trail, and pressed on. As I descended, the trail became less distinct. There were fewer markers, more undergrowth, and several places where the path split and rejoined. I knew I was in the right general area from my map, but the more I walked, the more I noticed that the trail seemed to be fading. It wasn't dangerous yet, but it demanded attention. Around late afternoon, I came to a point where the main trail disappeared into a dense thicket. My map indicated a faint path continuing in that direction, but I couldn't see it on the ground. I took a careful step into the bushes and found that the undergrowth was thick, full of thorns and fallen branches. I pushed forward slowly, trying to follow the map. At first, it was manageable, but then I tripped over a hidden root and stumbled into a muddy patch, nearly dropping my backpack. I stopped and examined my route. I could see the faint trace of a path, but it was barely there, overgrown and slick from recent rain. It was late afternoon, and the sun was already low in the sky. I realized that if I didn't find a proper place to camp soon, I would be hiking in darkness through thick forest, and that was dangerous. I looked around for a flat area and finally found a small clearing. It wasn't perfect, there were roots and rocks, but it was enough for my tent. I set it up quickly, trying to get everything ready before the forest grew too dark. As I worked, I kept noticing small things out of place. Broken branches that didn't look natural, patches of mud that seemed recently disturbed, faint footprints I couldn't identify. I tried not to let it bother me. Hiking solo had always required a certain level of paranoia, and I reasoned that these signs were probably wildlife or the result of someone else hiking the area before me. After a quick meal and checking my gear, I crawled into my tent. The wind picked up, rustling the trees, and I listened to the forest settle into night. Somewhere nearby, a branch snapped loudly, and my heart jumped. I told myself it was just an animal. I eventually fell asleep, uneasy but too tired to worry much. Around midnight, I woke to a sound that immediately set my nerves on edge. It was faint at first, a dragging or shuffling sound, coming from somewhere outside my tent. I froze, trying to make sense of it. My flashlight was across the tent, and reaching for it would make noise. The sound came again, closer this time, and it wasn't rhythmic like an animal walking. It was deliberate, slow, and heavy. I stayed perfectly still, straining to listen. I realized that whatever it was moving in a straight line, past my tent and deeper into the forest. My first thought was a wild animal, maybe a bear or a mountain lion, but the sound wasn't right. Bears don't drag their feet. Mountain lions don't rustle through underbrush like this. I considered packing up and leaving quietly, but the darkness made the path invisible, and I knew stepping out blindly could be dangerous. I stayed as still as possible until the sound faded. Eventually, I convinced myself it was likely a large animal that had passed by, and I forced myself to sleep again, though fitfully. Morning came slowly. I left the tent and examined the area. That's when I saw it. Footprints in the mud near my tent. They were large, human, and irregular. Not the clean tread of a hiker, but the sloppy imprint of someone who had moved quickly, dragging something heavy. My stomach dropped. I checked the surrounding forest for any signs, but there was nothing. No other footprints, no discarded items, no fire. Just the impression of someone, maybe still nearby. I felt a sense of isolation and vulnerability that I hadn't anticipated. My first instinct was to get off that trail as quickly as possible. I packed my gear carefully, making sure to leave nothing that could draw attention, and began hiking in the direction my map indicated toward the nearest secondary trail that might lead out of the wilderness. The day was long and tense. Every sound made me tense. Branches breaking, birds scattering, the distant murmur of water. I was hyper-aware of my surroundings, constantly checking behind me. I thought I saw movement several times, fleeting shadows between trees, but each time I looked directly, there was nothing. I reminded myself repeatedly that fear made your mind invent things, but it didn't make it any easier. By late afternoon, I reached a small stream, one that my map indicated was a minor tributary leading to the larger valley trail. I knelt to filter water, careful not to leave a scent or mark of my presence. While crouched, I saw movement downstream, something large and human-shaped, standing partially obscured by the trees. My heart froze. I didn't run. I didn't want to make sudden noise, but I knew that if it followed me, I had to stay alert. After a few minutes, it moved back into the shadows and disappeared. I debated my options. The most sensible was to stick to the waterway, which would eventually lead to a wider, more traveled trail. I followed the stream, moving as quietly as possible. The forest grew thicker, the ground more uneven, but I pressed on. Around dusk, the faint outline of a trail appeared, just a narrow dirt path, but clearly man-made. My relief was immense. I stayed alert, walking quickly but cautiously, knowing that I wasn't completely safe yet. I kept an eye on every shadow, every rustle. Hours passed. The sun disappeared, leaving only the fading light, but the trail was easy to follow. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I emerged onto a larger gravel trail that led to the main park road. A few cars passed by, and I stopped a man to call for help. Soon, rangers arrived and took a report. They confirmed that someone had been camping illegally in the area, and there had been reports of theft and stalking of hikers, which explained the footprints and the dragging sound I had heard the night before. They advised me to stay in safer areas and to always hike with someone, especially in remote trails. After that hike, I took months before I returned to the wilderness. The experience had left me shaken, not because of ghosts or wild animals, but because of human unpredictability and the vulnerability of being completely alone in a vast, isolated area. I learned to respect the isolation, to prepare for unexpected encounters, and to always trust instincts over convenience. Hiking was still my escape, still my love, but that trail, that ridge, and those shadows would stay with me forever. A reminder that real danger doesn't come from myths. It comes from reality, from people, and from situations where you are truly alone and unprotected. I had planned the hike for weeks, carefully mapping out a trail that was supposed to be moderately challenging, but still manageable for someone like me who had a decent level of fitness but not much experience with long, remote hikes. I had packed carefully, enough food, water, a small first aid kit, my map, compass, a flashlight, extra batteries, and even a lightweight tarp in case I had to stay out longer than expected. The weather forecast had been good, clear skies, mild temperatures, but I knew from past experience that conditions could change quickly in the mountains. Still, I didn't expect what was about to happen. The trail started off easy enough. The first few miles were gentle, with soft dirt underfoot and pine trees that filtered the sunlight, casting shadows across the path. Birds were singing, and a gentle breeze rustled through the leaves. I felt calm and confident, walking at a steady pace, glancing at the map every so often to make sure I was on track. The air smelled clean, slightly earthy, and the distant sound of a stream added a pleasant background to the quiet forest. Around mid-morning, the trail began to climb. It was steeper than I expected, and the soft dirt gave way to loose gravel and rocks. I had to watch every step, careful not to slip. The incline was gradual at first, but soon the trail wound sharply up the mountainside, zigzagging between patches of dense trees. The sun was higher in the sky now, and the shadows under the trees were stark. I noticed the temperature was rising too. It was hotter than I expected, and the exertion made me sweat. I stopped for a short break, drank some water, and checked my map again. I was roughly halfway to the point I had marked as a lookout. From there, I intended to take another trail down toward the river, completing a loop before nightfall. I continued upward, feeling the fatigue in my legs. The trail narrowed in some places, forcing me to walk single file and be careful where I placed my feet. Loose rocks crunched under my boots, and every now and then I had to grab tree roots or boulders to steady myself. The scenery was breathtaking, distant mountain peaks, the deep green of the forest canopy below, a faint trail of smoke rising from somewhere far off, probably from a campsite, but I kept my attention mostly on the trail. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. There were fresh footprints on the path, deep and uneven, and they didn't look like mine. I paused, looking around. There was no one else in sight, and the trail behind me was empty. I couldn't tell exactly what kind of animal it was, but the size was unnerving. It was bigger than a deer, larger than anything I had seen in the area, with deep imprints that suggested heavy weight. The prints seemed to appear suddenly and then disappear as the trail widened. My heart began to beat faster, not because I was sure there was a danger, but because the unknown always has that effect. I shook my head and tried to focus. Most likely it was nothing. A large dog, a hiker who had passed earlier, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept walking, ears alert to the slightest sound. The forest, which had felt calm and comforting earlier, now felt tense and oppressive. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig underfoot, made me flinch. I checked my watch, still plenty of time before dark, but my confidence had started to fade. As I climbed higher, the trail became more exposed. Trees thinned out, replaced by sharp rocks and steep inclines. I had to scramble over boulders, using both hands and feet to find secure footing. The wind picked up at these elevations, brushing against my face and making the temperature drop suddenly. Sweat cooled on my skin, leaving me shivering despite the heat from exertion. I tried to keep my focus on moving upward, calculating each step carefully, but my mind kept wandering back to the footprints. Then it happened. A sudden sound behind me. A low, heavy thud, like a tree trunk hitting the ground, but too precise, too deliberate, made me freeze. I didn't move for a long moment, listening. Nothing. The wind blew, the trees swayed, but there was no other sound. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I told myself it was probably just a rock sliding or an animal, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger with every step. I pressed onward, but now I was moving slower, my pace measured and cautious. The trail was less defined here, eroded in places, and narrow ledges overlooked sheer drops. I realized I had underestimated the difficulty of this section. My legs were burning, and I could feel the tightness in my calves and thighs. My water supply was low, and I took small sips, rationing it, knowing that I might be out longer than planned if I had to turn back slowly. The landscape changed again. I reached a plateau where the trees ended, leaving a panoramic view of the valley below. I stopped for a moment, catching my breath and taking in the view. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the peaks. It was beautiful, almost calming, but I didn't linger. I had to keep moving. The path forward was unclear. My map indicated a faint trail leading down the other side of the plateau, toward a creek that would eventually connect to the river. I started down, using the rocks and sparse vegetation for balance. The slope was steep and loose, and several times my boots slipped, forcing me to grab at the rocks with my hands. Then, about halfway down, I noticed something else. Disturbances in the ground, freshly broken branches, footprints that weren't mine, deeper and heavier than before. My stomach sank. Whoever or whatever had left these marks was large, strong, and close. The thought made every nerve in my body tense. I paused, crouched low behind a boulder, trying to see if I could catch a glimpse of movement. My eyes scanned the area, but nothing. No figure, no shadow, only the occasional rustle of leaves from the wind. I realized that if someone had been following me, they had stayed out of sight deliberately. My mind raced with possibilities, and none of them were comforting. The logical part of me said to retreat, to climb back to the plateau and wait until daylight. But the other part of me knew that turning back would be harder than continuing, given how steep and unstable the slope had become. I moved slowly, deliberately, keeping my body low, and avoided stepping on loose rocks that could give away my presence. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and loud in my ears. My hands were sweaty, my fingers slippery on the rocks. Every shadow, every subtle movement of leaves seemed like a threat. The plateau felt suddenly enormous and empty, yet threatening at the same time. Hours passed. I was exhausted, dehydrated, and the sun was beginning to sink below the horizon. The shadows grew long and deep, making navigation more difficult. I knew I had to find a safe place to wait for darkness to fade, but the terrain offered little protection. Finally, I spotted a narrow gap between rocks that created a small overhang, just enough to shield me from the wind and give me a place to sit. I lowered myself carefully, trying to stay hidden from any potential observer. My heart was still racing, but I forced myself to take slow breaths to conserve energy. Night fell completely, and with it came complete silence. The wind died down, the forest seemed to hold its breath. I realized that I couldn't see the trail ahead anymore, and moving in the dark on this terrain was far too dangerous. I decided to stay put until morning. I used my tarp and wrapped myself in it, trying to stay warm. My legs ached, my back hurt from crouching, and my throat was dry, but sleep, or at least rest, was impossible. I was alert, tense, listening for the slightest sound. Every small noise sent a jolt of fear through me, but hours passed without incident. When the first light of dawn appeared, I was still alive, though exhausted and stiff. I slowly emerged from my hiding place, scanning the terrain. Everything looked different in daylight. The rocks were less threatening, the trail more visible, and the valley below seemed calm and peaceful. I realized that I had survived the night, but I couldn't linger. I needed water, food, and a safe route back. I carefully retraced my steps down the slope, avoiding the areas where the footprints had been heaviest. I moved slowly, deliberately, keeping my eyes on the terrain ahead. The forest slowly thickened again, offering more stable footing. I found the creek my map had indicated and drank water cautiously, filtering it through a small cloth I carried. My legs were sore, but the thought of making it back safely gave me the strength to continue. By late morning, I reached the river and followed it downstream, using it as a guide back to the trailhead. The trail was easier now, and I could see the dirt path clearly. My pace increased, driven by relief and exhaustion. Eventually, I saw the parking lot in the distance, and the sight of cars and people felt almost surreal. I made it back without incident, but the memory of the footprints, the sense of being watched, and the terror of that night stayed with me long after. I learned a lot from that hike: the importance of preparation, the unpredictability of remote terrain, and the fact that fear can be as real and dangerous as any physical threat. I returned home, sore and shaken, but alive. I knew I had been lucky, and I carried that lesson with me every time I ventured into the mountains after that. The mountains were beautiful, but they were also unforgiving, and respect for them was not optional. I never underestimated a trail again. I had been planning this hike for months, a solo trek through the high, rugged ridges of the backcountry. I had chosen a trail that few people took, a narrow path that cut through steep slopes, dense forests, and rocky ridgelines. The map said it was about 18 miles from the trailhead to the nearest accessible road, but I knew from experience that distances in the mountains never matched what maps promised. The first day, I woke before dawn, the air still cool, and packed my backpack with the usual essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, stove, water filters, extra food, first aid, and layers for changing weather. I double-checked everything, feeling the slight thrill of anticipation and the deep calm that always came when I knew I was prepared. The drive to the trailhead had taken hours, winding along narrow, potholed forest roads, past streams that gleamed in the morning light and the occasional cluster of cabins tucked into the trees. By the time I parked, the sun was just rising, spilling pale orange light across the peaks. I shouldered my pack and stepped onto the trail. The air smelled like wet pine and moss. There was no one else around, only the soft rush of wind through the needles and the distant caw of a crow. I breathed deeply and began walking, each step measured, mindful of the loose rocks that littered the narrow trail. At first, the hike was uneventful. The trail climbed steadily, but not steeply, and the forest was thick and quiet. I passed moss-covered boulders and streams that trickled across the path. Occasionally, I saw the remnants of old logging trails, rutted with years of erosion, but nothing more. My feet moved rhythmically, the weight of the pack on my shoulders familiar and comforting. I stopped periodically to drink water, filter a bit more from a stream, and take photographs of the jagged peaks and the deep valleys below. Everything felt right. By mid-afternoon, the trail began to change. The forest thinned, the trees shorter, stunted by the altitude, and the path narrowed further. Loose gravel and scree replaced the dirt beneath my feet, and the slope on one side dropped sharply into a sheer, rocky ravine. I tightened my boots and moved slowly, feeling the wind pick up. It whistled past the rocks and through the sparse trees, carrying a chill that made me pull my jacket tighter. The sun was high but muted behind clouds gathering over the peaks, and I noted to myself that weather could turn quickly here. I set up a brief break on a flat section of the trail, sitting on a boulder with my legs dangling over the edge. I ate a snack and drank slowly, surveying the ridges. Everything looked empty, but I reminded myself that mountain weather and isolation could play tricks on the senses. Shadows moved oddly among rocks, and distant cliffs seemed to shift as clouds passed overhead. I shook my head, laughed quietly at my own tension, and resumed walking. Around late afternoon, The clouds thickened, dark gray, and heavy with the promise of rain. I picked up my pace, calculating that I could reach a small plateau marked on the map where I had planned to camp. The trail became more difficult, narrow, and slick with scattered pine needles and loose stones. My boots slipped a few times and I caught myself on tree roots or rocks. The wind gusted, cold and sharp, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall. I pulled my rain jacket over my pack and tightened the straps. It started raining steadily as I approached the plateau. The soil turned into mud, and puddles formed in every dip. I searched for a flat spot for my tent and found a small clearing surrounded by low scrub trees. I set up quickly, hammering stakes into the wet, soft ground, and moved my pack inside. By the time I crawled into my sleeping bag, the rain was coming down in sheets, and the wind moaned through the trees. I lay awake, listening to the storm, the isolation pressing against me, and felt a creeping tension settle in my chest. Morning came gray and wet. The rain had stopped, but the ground was soaked, the air cold and damp. I packed up, careful to keep my gear dry as best I could, and continued along the ridge trail. The rocks were slippery, covered in moss and residual rainwater, and the narrow path demanded complete focus. I had learned from experience that a misstep here could mean a fall of several hundred feet. I moved slowly, deliberately, testing every rock before putting my weight on it. Around mid-morning, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The trail ahead, the narrow ridge path I had been following for hours, was blocked by a small landslide. Rocks and mud had fallen, covering the path, and it looked recent. Loose stones tumbled down the slope when I tested them with my boot. I examined the sides of the landslide, looking for a safe way around. There was no obvious route along the ridge. The slope on the other side dropped sharply, almost vertical in places. The trees on the edges were thin, with roots barely gripping the wet soil. I tried to find a way down to the base of the landslide, hoping to cross it and climb back up, but the rocks were unstable, slick, and unpredictable. Every move required caution, testing each handhold and foothold. I knew one wrong step could send me tumbling down the slope. I sat on a larger boulder, trying to calm myself, and assessed my options. I had a map and compass, but the ridges were complex, and finding a safer route would mean retracing miles along difficult terrain. I calculated that it could take hours. I decided to backtrack slightly, looking for a detour along a minor ridge that branched off the main trail. It was slow work. The ground was wet, the roots slick, and every misstep felt amplified by the isolation and potential danger. After an hour, I found a narrow path that seemed to continue upward. I proceeded carefully, using trekking poles to test stability. As I moved, the terrain became steeper and the trail less defined. I realized I was now navigating almost entirely by memory and rough map references. The sun, partially hidden behind clouds, cast deep shadows across the slopes, making it difficult to judge distances. By late afternoon, I had reached a high point with no obvious continuation of the trail. The ridge dropped sharply on either side, and behind me, the landslide blocked my original path. I was trapped in a narrow, exposed section with steep cliffs below and no easy descent. My heart raced as I looked for any possibility. I knew from past experience that climbing down loose rock on a wet slope was far more dangerous than waiting for a safer opportunity, even if it meant spending the night here. I set up my tent as best I could on a narrow ledge, wedging stakes into cracks between rocks and using my backpack to stabilize it against the wind. It was cramped and uncomfortable, but at least it provided some shelter. I stayed alert, constantly listening for the sounds of shifting rocks or sudden gusts. That night, I barely slept, my body tense, muscles ready to react. I ate only a small amount, saving most of my rations for the next day. The wind howled, and rain dripped through sparse tree branches, making small streams across the ledge. The next morning, I climbed out of the tent cautiously. The ridge had dried slightly, but the rocks remained slick, and I moved inch by inch. I had studied the map all night, trying to find any alternative path that could lead me down safely. I decided to navigate along a minor slope that descended slightly to the west, hoping to reach a small creek marked on the map that would lead to the lower forest. Every step required testing the ground with my trekking poles and boots. Loose stones slid underfoot, and I had to dig my heels in to maintain balance. My legs ached. My hands were scraped from grabbing rocks for stability, and my body was exhausted. Hours passed, but slowly I made progress. I found the creek I had hoped for, water flowing through a narrow gully. The descent became more gradual, and I could step carefully among the stones without the constant fear of a fatal slip. I followed the creek downward, the sound of rushing water providing a strange sense of comfort after the tense exposure on the ridge. The forest grew denser as I descended, moss and ferns covering rocks, and the air smelled of wet earth and decaying leaves. I could finally breathe more normally, my heart rate slowing. By late afternoon, I reached a wider section of the forest and found a small campsite used by other hikers. Fire rings and flattened ground indicated that people had stayed here before. I took a long break, ate a substantial meal, and rested my weary muscles. I filtered water from the creek and filled my bottles, knowing I still had several miles to go before reaching the road. I planned the rest of my descent, moving carefully along the forest paths that eventually led to a dirt service road. Over the next day, I hiked through the dense forest, occasionally using the map and compass to confirm my route. My legs were sore, my shoulders stiff from the heavy pack, but the terrain became easier as I descended. By evening, I reached the road, hearing the faint sound of traffic in the distance. Relief washed over me. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past 2 days lift slightly. I followed the road down, eventually spotting my car parked at the trailhead where I had started. I unloaded my pack, checked my gear, and sat in the car for a long moment, exhausted but profoundly grateful to be safe. The sun had come out, warming the asphalt and the air. My body ached. My hands and legs bore minor scrapes, but I had made it through an extremely dangerous situation without serious injury. The memory of the narrow ridge, the landslide, and the precarious ledge remained vivid, a reminder of how carefully one must tread in the backcountry. Driving home, I reflected on the hike. It had been the scariest, most tense solo trip I had ever undertaken, a real test of focus, endurance, and careful planning. I knew I had been lucky in many ways. The rain had not turned into a full storm, the landslide had occurred in a location I could assess, and my cautious approach had kept me safe. But the lesson was clear. Preparation, attention, and respect for the terrain were paramount. By the time I reached my house, I was physically drained but mentally clear. I cleaned my gear, took a long shower, and rested. Over the next days, I documented the route, marked the dangerous sections, and noted the lessons learned. I knew I would hike again, but the ridge and landslide would remain a vivid memory, a reminder of both the beauty and danger of the mountains. I slept well that night, the memory of fear replaced with satisfaction, confidence, and an appreciation for the mountain's raw, unpredictable power.